Some people write angry texts. These 10 geniuses chose violence and accidentally chose death. Today, we're diving into the dumbest ways people died while trying to enact petty revenge. From sabotaged plumbing to weaponized dog poop, these grudges didn't just backfire, they were terminal. It turns out karma is just physics with a nasty sense of humor. Warning: do not try this at home. 1. It was a Tuesday night in suburban Ohio, the kind of night where the silence is heavy, the streetlights hum with boredom, and nothing exciting ever happens, unless you were Gary. Gary was the self-appointed sheriff of his cul-de-sac, a man whose hobbies included measuring his neighbor's grass height with a ruler and keeping a detailed log of unauthorized dog barks. But tonight, Gary faced a nemesis that couldn't be defeated by a passive-aggressive note left on a windshield. A massive 18-wheel semi-truck had parked directly in front of his house. The driver, a tired long hauler probably just trying to grab 4 hours of sleep before a morning delivery, had no idea he had parked his rig on sacred ground. To Gary, this wasn't just a parking violation. It was an act of war, a direct challenge to his authority as the supreme ruler of the sidewalk. He needed to send a message, something permanent, something that said, "Don't tread on me." His plan was as simple as it was suicidally stupid. He was going to slash a tire. Gary went into his garage and grabbed his weapon of choice, a tactical folding knife he'd bought at a gas station for $12, a blade that had previously only battled Amazon boxes and the occasional loose thread. He crept out into the darkness, moving with the stealth of a ninja who breathes too loud, and approached the sleeping giant. Now, here is where Gary's lack of mechanical knowledge becomes fatal. He looked at that tire and saw a big balloon. He assumed it would go hiss and flatten out, leaving the driver with a headache in the morning. But let's pause for a quick physics lesson that Gary desperately needed. A standard car tire holds about 32 psi of pressure, enough to startle you if it pops. A commercial semi-truck tire, however, is a steel-belted pressure vessel containing over 110 psi of explosive force. To put that in perspective, the potential energy stored inside that rubber donut is enough to launch a bowling ball over the Empire State Building. It's not a tire, it's a bomb wrapped in rubber, waiting for a trigger. Gary, oblivious to the fact that he was standing in the blast radius of an industrial explosive, raised his cheap knife. He didn't just poke it. He lunged, driving the blade into the sidewall with all the force of his righteous indignation. He expected a leak. What he got was a detonation. The structural integrity of the tire failed instantly. The air didn't leak, it escaped at supersonic speeds. The sidewall burst outward, creating a shockwave that hit Gary like a solid wall of invisible concrete. The explosion was so violent, it didn't just blow the knife out of his hand. It turned the blade into shrapnel and sent the handle flying into the next zip code. But the air pressure alone was the real executioner. The blast wave slammed into his chest cavity with the force of a sledgehammer swung by a giant, stopping his heart instantly and shattering his ribcage like dry kindling. The truck driver woke up thinking a grenade had gone off, terrified and confused. He climbed down to find Gary lying on the lawn, looking like he'd gone 12 rounds with a cannon. In his quest to inconvenience the truck driver for a few hours, Gary had achieved the ultimate irony. The police investigation into his accidental self-deletion meant the truck had to stay parked exactly where it was for another 48 hours as evidence. Gary didn't move the truck. He became a permanent, cautionary fixture of the parking violation he hated so much. 2. There is a specific category of person who believes that the absolute pinnacle of comedy is messing with someone's plumbing. And sitting squarely at the top of this hierarchy of immaturity was a 24-year-old named Kyle. Kyle was currently at a house party in a jagged, upscale apartment complex in Miami, but he wasn't having a good time. His ego had been bruised. The host, a guy named Steve, had committed the unforgivable sin of telling Kyle to stop trying to DJ with his Spotify playlist and to please stop hitting on his girlfriend. Wounded, slightly intoxicated, and fueled by a sense of entitlement that defied logic, Kyle decided that Steve needed to be punished. He wasn't going to steal anything or start a fight. No, Kyle was going to leave a gift. He settled on the upper decker, a legendary and grotesque prank that involves leaving a biological deposit not in the toilet bowl, but in the upper water tank, ensuring a horrifying surprise for weeks to come. It's a prank that requires balance, precision, and a complete lack of dignity. Three things Kyle was currently struggling to maintain. He snuck into the master bathroom, a room tiled in slippery, expensive marble that cost more than Kyle's car, and locked the door. He giggled to himself, imagining Steve's face a week from now, unaware that he was about to star in his own final tragedy. Now, let's look at the logistics here. Modern toilets are designed for sitting, not for acrobatics. The porcelain tank lid is not a stability platform, and the rim of the bowl is curved and slippery. Kyle removed the heavy tank lid, placing it on the floor, and prepared to mount the throne in reverse. He perched his socked feet on the narrow, curved rim of the bowl to hover over the open tank, executing a precarious squat that would have challenged a sober Olympic gymnast. Kyle was neither sober nor an Olympian. As he shifted his weight to get into position, his foot hit a patch of condensation on the smooth porcelain rim. Friction left the chat immediately. His legs shot out from under him, and gravity took the wheel. Kyle didn't just fall. He came down with his full dead weight directly onto the exposed ceramic edge of the toilet tank and the bowl below. Porcelain is a strange material. It's incredibly hard, but it is brittle. When it shatters, it doesn't break into dull chunks like wood or plastic. It shears into edges that are sharper than surgical scalpels. The toilet disintegrated under the impact of his falling body, exploding into a pile of razor-sharp shards. One massive, jagged piece of the broken bowl sliced upward into his inner thigh, acting like a guillotine and severing the femoral artery in a split second. The comedy of the moment vanished instantly, replaced by a catastrophic medical emergency in a locked, soundproofed bathroom. The femoral artery is like a garden hose for your blood supply. Severing it is a game-over event without immediate surgery. Kyle tried to stand, but the blood loss was massive and immediate. By the time the party guests heard the crash, argued about who should check on him, and finally managed to break down the heavy door, Kyle had already faded out. He wanted to leave a mess for Steve to clean up, and in the most tragic, literal sense possible, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He died in a pile of rubble and regret, pants around his ankles, immortalized not as the life of the party, but as the guy who fought a toilet and lost in a landslide. 3. The feud between Arthur and the Miller family next door was the stuff of neighborhood legend, a Cold War fought with passive-aggressive notes, property line disputes, and the strategic placement of ugly lawn gnomes. Arthur was a man who viewed silence as a personal constitutional right and other people's fun as a zoning violation. So, when the Millers decided to host a massive graduation party for their daughter, complete with a live band, laughter, and joy, Arthur viewed it as a direct assault on his sovereignty. He sat in his dark living room, stewing in his own misery, listening to the bass thump through his walls. He needed a weapon, something to clear the yard without technically breaking the noise ordinance or getting arrested for assault. His eyes landed on the overgrown patch of vines choking the back corner of his lot. He knew exactly what it was: Toxicodendron radicans, better known as poison ivy. A light bulb went off in his head, illuminating a plan that was as malicious as it was scientifically illiterate. He spent the afternoon dressed like a hazmat technician, carefully pulling up huge bundles of the oily, three-leafed menace, piling it into a wheelbarrow. His plan was chemical warfare. He would wait until the wind was blowing toward the Miller's patio, light a massive bonfire on his side of the fence, and throw the poison ivy onto the flames. He imagined the guests coughing, itching, and fleeing in terror as the smoke ruined their burgers. It was, in his mind, the perfect crime, a natural deterrent. As evening fell and the party picked up steam, Arthur lit his fire pit. He waited for the flames to get roaring hot, rubbing his hands together like a cartoon villain before dumping his green payload into the heart of the fire. But Arthur forgot the golden rule of meteorology. Wind is fickle, and nature doesn't take sides. Just as the thick, oily smoke began to billow up, laden with vaporized urushiol oil, the toxic compound that causes blistering rashes, a sudden downdraft swirled into the yard. The wind didn't carry the smoke over the fence. It curled it backward, enveloping Arthur in a dense white cloud of his own making. Now, getting poison ivy on your skin is bad. It causes an itch that lasts for weeks. But inhaling it? That is a medical catastrophe. The urushiol oil doesn't burn away. It hitches a ride on the smoke particles, coating the inside of the throat, the trachea, and the lungs. As Arthur stood there, breathing deep to cough the smoke away, his respiratory system went into immediate anaphylactic shock. The lining of his airway reacted to the toxin by blistering and swelling violently, sealing his throat shut from the inside within minutes. It was a chemical burn on a cellular level. He stumbled toward the house, clawing at a throat that was rapidly closing, but the reaction was too fast and too severe. While the Millers' party continued joyfully on the other side of the fence, completely unaware of the failed sabotage or the drama unfolding 10 feet away, Arthur collapsed on his own patio. He was asphyxiated by the very botanical weapon he had tried to deploy. He had attempted to ruin a party with a rash, but instead, he gave himself a terminal dose of nature's vengeance, proving that if you try to weaponize Mother Nature, she will eventually fire back. 4. There is a special circle of hell reserved for people who are rude to service workers, but Harold was aiming for the VIP section. Harold was a 60-year-old retiree whose primary hobby was nursing grudges until they grew into full-blown vendettas. His latest obsession was the local mail carrier, a perfectly nice guy named Dave, whose only crime was occasionally delivering the mail at 2 p.m. instead of the proper 11 a.m. To Harold, this wasn't a logistical issue. It was a personal insult, a deliberate attempt to ruin his afternoon routine of staring out the window. After weeks of yelling at Dave for walking on the grass, Harold decided that verbal abuse wasn't enough. He needed physical deterrence. It was the dead of winter in Minnesota, a time when the air hurts your face and the ground is harder than a politician's heart. Harold hatched a plan that was as cold as the weather. He was going to create a slip-and-fall hazard that even a lawyer would admire. Late one freezing Tuesday night, while the rest of the neighborhood slept the sleep of the innocent, Harold crept out with a garden hose. He meticulously watered the concrete steps leading up to his front porch, layering the water until it formed a perfect, invisible sheet of black ice. He chuckled to himself, picturing Dave's inevitable comical tumble the next day. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive engineering, a trap laid with malice and H2O. Harold went to bed satisfied, dreaming of bruised mailmen. But here is the thing about traps. They don't have an identify friend or foe system. The next morning, Harold woke up groggy, his mind foggy with sleep and the lingering excitement of his revenge plot. He heard the distinctive thwack of the morning paper hitting his driveway. Instinct took over. Forgetting entirely about the icy minefield he had laid just 8 hours prior, Harold opened the front door in his fuzzy slippers and bathrobe to retrieve the news. He took one confident step onto the porch. Physics, which had been waiting patiently for this moment, acted immediately. The coefficient of friction between fuzzy slippers and black ice is effectively 0. Harold's feet didn't just slide, they accelerated to warp speed. His legs flew out from under him so fast he was horizontal before his brain even registered the fall. He didn't have time to flail, he just went down like a felled tree. The back of his head met the concrete edge of the top step with a sickening crack. Now the human skull is tough, but concrete is undefeated. The impact caused a massive intracranial hemorrhage, a brain bleed, that shut his system down before he even stopped sliding. He lay there on his own frozen creation, staring up at the gray sky, a victim of his own memory loss. When Dave the mailman arrived hours later, he carefully navigated the ice using his issued traction cleats, found Harold, and called 911. Harold had set a trap to break a mailman's leg, but instead, he broke his own skull, proving that if you're going to ice the competition, you should probably remember where you put the ice. 5. Love hurts, but a bad breakup can be fatal if you don't understand basic chemistry. Meet Kevin, a 22-year-old whose emotional maturity was rivaled only by his lack of common sense. Kevin had recently been dumped by his girlfriend, Sarah, for being too dramatic, a claim he was about to prove spectacularly correct. Unable to process his emotions like an adult, Kevin decided that if his heart was broken, Sarah's car should be too. He settled on the classic sugar in the gas tank myth, believing it would turn her engine into a solid block of caramel. Armed with a 5-pound bag of granulated sugar and a cheap plastic funnel he bought at a dollar store, Kevin set out into the dry, cold night to exact his revenge. He found Sarah's car parked on the street, looked around for witnesses, and popped the fuel door. He unscrewed the gas cap, inserted the plastic funnel, and began to pour. Now, let's pause for a science lesson that Kevin skipped in high school. Sugar is a crystalline solid. Plastic is an insulator. When you pour dry crystals rapidly through a plastic tube in dry air, you generate friction. This friction strips electrons, building up a massive static electrical charge. The same principle that makes a balloon stick to your hair, but on a much more dangerous scale. The fuel tank of a car isn't empty. It's filled with gasoline vapors, which are infinitely more flammable than the liquid itself. As Kevin poured, the static charge built up on the tip of the plastic funnel until it reached a critical voltage. Zap. A tiny blue spark jumped from the funnel to the metal rim of the fuel neck. That spark was all it took. The gasoline vapors didn't just burn. They ignited with the speed and ferocity of a bomb. Because Kevin was leaning directly over the open filler neck to watch the sugar go in, he was in the worst possible position. A fireball erupted from the gas tank, a jet of superheated flame that hit Kevin square in the face. This wasn't a Hollywood explosion where the car flips over. It was a flash fire, a sudden, intense burst of heat that incinerated his eyebrows, hair, and most importantly, seared his airways instantly. He inhaled the flame in his panic. The thermal shock caused his larynx and lungs to swell shut in seconds, a condition known as laryngeal edema. He stumbled back, clawing at his throat, his face a ruin of third-degree burns, unable to draw breath. He collapsed on the sidewalk next to the car, suffocating in the open air, killed by a science experiment he didn't even know he was conducting. Sarah's car needed a new paint job, but Kevin needed a new respiratory system. He died trying to kill a Honda Civic, proving that revenge is sweet, but static electricity is a killer. 6. There are neighbor disputes, and then there is the Great Fecal War of 2023. On one side was Mr. Henderson, a man who treated his lawn like a putting green at Augusta. On the other was a golden retriever named Buster, who viewed Henderson's lawn as his personal toilet. After weeks of finding unwanted gifts on his pristine grass and getting no apology from the neighbors, Henderson decided that passive aggression was too slow. He needed ballistics. Being a retired engineer with too much time and not enough supervision, Henderson went into his workshop and built a device of pure vengeance, the catapult. It was a spring-loaded catapult designed specifically to launch Buster's frozen deposits back over the 6-foot privacy fence with velocity and precision. He spent days calibrating the tension springs, calculating the trajectory, and reinforcing the throwing arm with steel. It was a marvel of petty engineering. The morning of the maiden launch arrived. Henderson loaded the payload, a particularly large frozen specimen he had saved for this occasion, into the bucket. He cranked the winch, compressing the heavy-duty garage door springs he had used for power. The tension was immense. The machine groaned under the stress. He aimed it at the neighbor's patio, giggling like a schoolgirl. But Henderson made a fatal calculation error. He had built the release mechanism out of cheap, cast aluminum, while the springs were industrial steel. As he leaned in close to make a final adjustment to the aiming sight, putting his head directly in the path of the throwing arm, the cheap latch gave way. It snapped under the pressure. The catapult fired prematurely. The heavy steel throwing arm, moving at roughly the speed of a major league fastball, swung upward in a violent arc. It didn't launch the payload. Instead, the solid steel bar connected directly with Henderson's right temple. The force was equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer swung by a giant. His skull caved in instantly. He dropped to the grass, stone dead before he hit the ground, lying next to his infernal machine. The frozen payload, dislodged by the impact, simply fell out of the bucket and landed on his chest, adding a final smelly insult to the fatal injury. The police found him hours later, killed by his own siege weapon. Henderson wanted to fling crap at his neighbors, but in the end, he just flung his own life away, proving that when you build a machine to throw dirt, you'd better make sure you're not standing in the splash zone. 7. If there was a Nobel Prize for bad neighbors, Barry would have been a laureate. But since that doesn't exist, he settled for being the petty tyrant of his townhouse complex. Barry's feud with the neighbor below him, a nice guy named Ted, who had the audacity to cook food that smelled like food, had escalated from angry notes to full-blown structural sabotage. Barry decided that if he had to smell Ted's dinner, Ted shouldn't be allowed to flush his toilet. His plan was a masterpiece of spiteful engineering. He would climb onto the roof and pour a bucket of quick-drying concrete down Ted's plumbing vent stack, effectively cementing the sewage system shut and causing a catastrophic backup. It was evil, it was illegal, and as it turns out, it was physically impossible for a man of Barry's limited coordination. He hauled a 5-gallon bucket of wet, heavy concrete up a ladder, which is a feat of strength that should have tipped him off that this was a bad idea. Concrete isn't just gray soup, it is liquid rock, weighing about 150 pounds per cubic foot. Barry wrestled this sloshing bucket of doom onto the pitched roof, his sneakers struggling for grip on the asphalt shingles. He reached the vent pipe, sweating and panting, and prepared to deliver his concrete payload. Here is where Barry forgot about Newton's laws of motion and the concept of a center of gravity. To pour the heavy bucket down the narrow pipe, Barry had to lean forward, extending the heavy weight away from his body. As the concrete began to flow, the center of gravity shifted rapidly from safe to terminal. The sludge rushed to the lip of the bucket, creating a sudden violent pull that Barry wasn't expecting. It was like wrestling a toddler made of lead. The momentum of the pouring concrete overcame the friction of his sneakers. Barry didn't just drop the bucket took him for a ride. He tipped past the point of no return, his center of mass swinging out over the abyss. He slid down the roof like a bobsledder on sandpaper, screaming all the way to the edge. There was no safety net, no soft bush, just the unforgiving reality of a concrete driveway 2 stories below. He landed headfirst, directly on top of the bucket he was holding, which effectively became the hammer to the driveway's anvil. The police found him in a tableau of poetic justice, a man who tried to cement his neighbor's pipes, but ended up cementing his own legacy as the neighborhood's flattest resident. He wanted to cause a blockage, but the only thing he stopped was his own pulse, proving that when you try to dump a heavy load on someone else, gravity usually dumps it right back on you. 8. There is a special kind of stupidity reserved for people who try to combine high explosives with moving vehicles, and 19-year-old Travis was the Picasso of this particular art form. Travis held a grudge against a former high school rival, a guy named Mike who had allegedly looked at him funny 3 years ago. To settle this ancient score, Travis devised a drive-by prank that belonged in a cartoon, not real life. He acquired an illegal quarter stick of dynamite, basically a firework on steroids that is less sparkler and more hand grenade, and planned to toss it into Mike's mailbox while driving past at 40 miles per hour. It was a plan that required the timing of a fighter pilot and the coordination of an athlete. Travis, unfortunately, possessed the coordination of a drunk giraffe. He cruised down Mike's dark suburban street, his heart pounding, lighter in one hand, explosive in the other. He lit the fuse. The sparks began to fly, hissing like a furious snake in the confines of his 2004 Honda Civic. This was the moment of truth. Travis wound up his arm for the pitch, looking at the mailbox approaching on his right. He threw the explosive with all his might. Thwack. He had forgotten one minor detail. He hadn't rolled the passenger window down quite far enough. Or maybe he just missed the opening entirely. Either way, the firework ricocheted off the window frame with a hollow thud and dropped not into the mailbox but directly into the center console, right between his legs. This is the moment where panic overrides cognitive function. Travis didn't stop the car and bail out. He didn't grab the explosive and try again. He just screamed. He took his eyes off the road to claw frantically at his own crotch, trying to find the sizzling bomb, completely forgetting that he was piloting a 2-ton metal missile at 40 miles per hour. The car drifted right, jumped the curb, and introduced itself intimately to a solid oak telephone pole. The impact deployed the airbags, pinning Travis in his seat, trapped in a small, enclosed space filled with smoke and regret. A split second later, the quarter stick detonated. The blast inside the cabin was devastating, turning the interior of the Honda into a pressure cooker of shrapnel and force. Between the massive trauma of the crash and the concussive blast occurring in his lap, Travis didn't stand a chance. He wanted to blow up a $20 plastic mailbox, but instead, he totaled his car and liquidated his own existence, providing a grim reminder that if you're going to play with fire, You should probably make sure the window is open first. 9. Living in an apartment building requires a certain level of tolerance, a trait that Elias had completely surgically removed from his personality. Elias lived below a family with a toddler who walked like a normal toddler, but to Elias, it sounded like a herd of tap-dancing elephants. After months of banging on the ceiling with a broom handle failed to stop the child from existing, Elias decided to escalate the war. He was an audiophile with a horde of vintage, high-wattage speakers and amplifiers, and he conceived a retaliation plan he called the Wall of Sound. He stacked 8 massive subwoofers and concert monitors on top of his dining table, facing them directly upward at the ceiling, inches from the plaster. His plan was to blast death metal at maximum volume all night long to give the upstairs neighbors a taste of their own medicine. But Elias had a problem. He needed to sleep in the apartment too. His solution was to wear a pair of industrial-grade, $400 noise-canceling headphones used by airport tarmac crews. He wired the system up, creating a terrifying tangle of extension cords and daisy-chained power strips that looked like a fire marshal's nightmare. He hit play, cranked the volume knobs to 11, put on his magical headphones, and drifted off to sleep in blissful silence, smug in his revenge. The upstairs neighbors didn't sleep. They evacuated, terrified by the floor-shaking vibrations. But down in Elias's apartment, physics was taking its toll. The vintage wiring in the walls and the cheap power strips were not designed to handle the massive amperage draw of a concert-level sound system running at peak power. The resistance built up heat. The insulation melted. Somewhere behind the drywall, a spark jumped, and the dry, dusty studs caught fire. The fire spread from the wall to the curtains and then to the wall of sound itself. The smoke alarm screamed its piercing warning, a sound designed to wake the dead, but it couldn't penetrate the active noise-canceling technology clamped over Elias's ears. He had engineered his own sensory deprivation tank. The fire roared. The room filled with thick, toxic smoke, and the heat intensified, but Elias slumbered on, effectively anesthetized by carbon monoxide before the flames even touched him. He never woke up. He had successfully built a sound system so loud it drowned out his own survival, proving that blocking out the world is great for relaxation, but terrible for not dying in a fiery inferno of your own making. 10. There are people who escalate neighbor disputes, and then there was Frank, a man who believed that a sewage backup was a valid form of conflict resolution. Frank was in a bitter war with his neighbor over a property line dispute involving a fence, and he decided to hit the neighbor where it hurt most: the plumbing. Frank located the neighbor's sewer cleanout valve, which was accessible from the street, and bought a professional-grade tool for his crime: a pneumatic test ball. This is a heavy-duty rubber balloon that plumbers insert into a pipe and inflate to block the flow of water for testing. Frank's plan was to insert the plug, inflate it, and leave it there, causing the neighbor's waste to back up into their house. It was a gross, petty plan, but Frank was a gross, petty man. He shoved the deflated rubber ball into the 6-inch pipe, attached the air hose, and fired up his portable air compressor. Now, the manufacturer's instructions on these plugs are written in big, bold red letters for a reason. They warn you not to overinflate, and crucially, they warn you never, ever to stand in the line of fire, directly in front of the pipe opening, while the plug is under pressure. Frank treated safety warnings like he treated his neighbor's property rights. He ignored them completely. He wanted that plug to be tight. He wanted it to be immovable. So he kept the compressor running, pushing the PSI way past the recommended limit of 30, up to 60, then 80. He stood directly over the hole, peering down into the dark pipe to admire his handiwork, his face inches from the opening. Down in the pipe, the rubber bladder was screaming under the stress. It distorted, losing its friction grip on the smooth pipe walls. Suddenly, the physics of a compressed air cannon took over. The plug didn't just pop. It shot out of the pipe like a rubber bullet fired from a sniper rifle. The accumulated pressure launched the heavy rubber ball upward with terrifying velocity. It covered the 3 feet of distance in milliseconds. The plug struck Frank directly in the face with the force of a bowling ball dropped from a skyscraper. The impact was catastrophic, shattering his facial bones and driving fragments into his brain, killing him instantly before his body even hit the ground. He was found by the very neighbor he tried to sabotage, lying next to the open pipe with the compressor still humming. Frank wanted to create a blockage, but instead, he turned a plumbing tool into a surface-to-air missile, proving that if you stare into the abyss of a pressurized pipe, the abyss eventually shoots you in the face. Gravity 10, Revenge 0. Now, I need you to settle a debate in the comments. Which one of these geniuses wins the award for the absolute dumbest death? Was it the tire slasher or the toilet guy? Cast your vote below. I want to see you fight it out. Click that like button if you have basic survival instincts, and subscribe so you don't end up as a cautionary tale in my next video.